Okay, so, dear colleagues, dear friends, those of you who came specially to Serhii Plokhy's lecture, once again, it's probably, for me personally, maybe the most important part of our summer, transregional summer academy, yeah, after violence, impossibility of understanding and remembering. For me personally, why so? Because as Denis rightly said, I was born in Dnipropetrovsk and then graduated from Dnipropetrovsk University, and already as a student, of course, I knew that there were some great historians who worked, let's say, before I started being a student, and one of them is, of course, Serhii Plokhy. And what's actually interesting, maybe not, I don't know, that now, I mean literally today, is the very first time that I meet Serhii here in Dnipro. Because we've met many times. First time in Australia, then in Canada, US, Berlin, Lviv, and so on, but never in Dnipro. So for me it's a very important symbolic event, if you wish. Now, my task is to briefly introduce you a historian who produced a lot of very, very important books. I also give you some names. But let me start, if I may, briefly, from, let's say, this Dnipropetrovsk period of Serhii Plokhy's biography, because he's one of the most talented but most famous, most well-known students of Mykola Kovalsky, who was a very prominent figure in, if you wish, Brezhnev time Dnipropetrovsk University. Mykola Kovalsky himself, a man born in Volhynia, graduated from Lviv University, a good friend of my academic supervisor Yaroslav Isayevich. And actually, I've never met Mykola Pavlovich personally. That's a pity, of course. But I knew a lot about him and his school. We even published an article about it together with my sister last year. And Serhii Plokhy graduated from Dnipropetrovsk State University in the year of 1980. Okay, so the end, if you wish, of the Brezhnev era in the Soviet Union. And then he defended his PhD thesis on Latin language sources on the Khmelnytsky uprising. Mykola Kovalsky was a supervisor of this work, and it was defended, which is very interesting, at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. So not here, but in Moscow. And afterwards, even more interesting maybe, in the year of 1986, so the very first stage of this opening the Soviet Union towards the West, rapprochement, reconciliation, if you wish. Serhii is an assistant professor in Dnipropetrovsk University, Department of World History. He spent 9 months in the United States at the Columbia University. So he was actually one of the very first, if I'm right, Soviet historians allowed to go to the US. And then in 1990, he defended his second dissertation, so habilitation or doctorская диссертация in Ukrainian, this time in Kyiv, in Taras Shevchenko National University. And then actually, in the 90s, when I started my education here, Serhii was already in Canada, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta, Edmonton. And then later on, since 2007, Mikhailo Grushevsky, professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. And then 2013, the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Now, I'll give you now the titles of some books, not all of them, some books published in English, so English titles, of Serhii Plokhy's books. And I hope you already feel the range, the scope of research interest, and the topics that we see here. So, the Cossacks and Religion in Early Modern Ukraine, 2002. Unmaking Imperial Russia, Mikhailo Grushevsky and the Writing of Ukrainian History, 2005. The Origins of the Slavic Nations, Pre-Modern Identities in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, 2006. Yalta, The Price of Peace, 2010. The Cossack Myth, History and Nationhood in the Age of Empires, 2012. The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, 2014. This book, one of the participants of our academy gave me to show you, so it's really functional. The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, 2015. One of my favorite. Last Kingdom, The Quest for Empire and the Making of the Russian Nation, 2017. And last but not least, which is very close to our topic, please here, Chernobyl, the history of a nuclear catastrophe, 2018. And I should also mention that literally a couple of days ago, this book was awarded Pushkin House Book Prize 2019, and Serhii Plokhy is the very first person, as far as I know, who received this prize twice. Because for the first one, he got it for The Last Empire in 2015. So it's incredible scope of topics and issues, and for our Summer Academy, Serhii proposed himself to speak about Chernobyl, which is very relevant, of course, for all of us. And now I'm very happy to give a floor to Serhii, and please, you're welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. It's really a pleasure and honor to be back home, and the place where I was a student, a graduate student, where I started teaching. And I was teaching in Russian, in Ukrainian, and even tried in English. And poor students were taking my classes back then. I hope there are no my English language professors and teachers here, and they will not point to possible mistakes in English. Andrii mentioned that I started. Yeah, sure. Andrii mentioned that I started as a historian of early modern Ukraine, so that means 16th and 17th century, and it's a very challenging field. But one thing that you know about that field is that whatever you write about, you are more or less the ultimate expert. You can discuss that with other scholars, but you can't have a situation in which you're given a talk and someone raises up and says, no, I was there back in 1654 and it was different, you got it wrong. So when I moved to writing about more contemporary topics, including the fall of the Soviet Union, the topic that was discussed in the book titled The Last Empire, and now in Chernobyl, on the one hand, it's an easier task. You work with the languages that you know. You don't need Latin. You don't need to read the handwritten texts from the 14th century. On the other hand, there is also a challenge. There is a challenge that you're writing about the things, and you're writing about people who were there at that time. This is their lives, their histories, their stories, their tragedies, their triumphs, and it's very humbling in many ways. And I don't know whether there are other people who were in Chernobyl and were in the exclusion zone at that time here in this room, but I know at least one, and this is my colleague here at the University then of Dnipro, Serhii Plokhy, who is now teaching history, Ukrainian and Soviet and East European history in the United States. And Serhii, I'm very thankful to you. I'm very thankful to all your friends. I'm very thankful to people who were in Chernobyl in '86, who really helped to save us and to save the world. And we are really indebted to you and to people with whom you served back then in the summer, in May and June and July of 1986.
Maybe one will join us.
Maybe one person will join. Okay, sure. Well, so thanks
Maybe
again.
two.
So thanks again. So that's to say that again. My work in Chernobyl was challenging. In one way that again, I visited Chernobyl, I visited the exclusion zone a number of times, but that happened already quite late. I wasn't there at that time. Another thing challenging is that it's still pretty close to my own life and my own experience and people whom I knew. And when you write a history, sometimes it's a danger. Sometimes it is a challenge. Sometimes you need that distance. And I was trying to deal with these two challenges at the same time. First of all, not being there and feeling guilty about that, but also trying to distance myself and to be as objective as I could be. And that's how that book came to existence. I started writing this book before the annexation of the Crimea, before the war in Donbass. And I had that feeling that the stories that I was looking into, the stories of people, their self-sacrifice very often and their heroism, that they were, allegedly I was there, allegedly I knew that type of people, but it was coming from somewhere else. They sounded unreal. And then happened Maidan, and then happened the war, and suddenly that became real. And in many ways, it helped me to maybe treat that a little bit differently and understand better also the events of 86 and 87. What you have here is the two covers of my book. One that appeared in the United States. It's different images and different titles, and also a very different visual solution of the question of Chernobyl and what it is. If in one case we have this really dark colors and drama of the events. In other case, it's kind of a banality of what had happened. So it's an operator who is there. So already the power plant is shut down, but he is smoking, so he's reflecting on maybe what happened. And again, in the book there are both these parts of the story. First of all, drama and tragedy, and also the banality of what happened, and also the belief that was there in the society as a whole, belief that was among the operators, among the engineers, that the nuclear power was very safe, that reactors don't explode. And these two things came together really in the events of 1986. I write my book, again, it is based on academic research, it is based also on the archival research. I worked with the, at that time, freshly declassified KGB files in Kiev and the materials of the State Commission that was organized by the Ukrainian Politburo, plus I used oral testimonies of the participants of the events. And I tell the story, it's academically based, but it is also addressed to a broad audience. So I tell it more or less in chronological order. It starts with the 27th Party Congress, which happened a few months before the explosion, and then goes chronologically all the way up until the year 2018, when the book was published, and when we have the completion of the construction of the new shelter above the reactor. And that's how book is structured. Here I will approach the themes, the topics, the personalities that are at the center of my book in a little bit different way. I will talk about the big themes that are involved in that story, and also try to make them relevant to today. Because one of the arguments of the book is that it would be easy to say that, okay, what happened in Chernobyl really belongs to the past. It is 1986. It's the communist system, and it's gone now, and we're in a completely different world, and we can treat that as history alone. My argument is that it's history, but the history that is relevant today. I have this slide, this picture here for a reason, more or less to illustrate the point that I just made. So Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is a very unique place in today's Ukraine. After passing of decommunization laws, the monuments to Lenin and leaders of the communist regime are very much outlawed everywhere in Ukraine, on the territory that is controlled by Ukrainian government today. So the Crimea and parts of Donbass are exception, but another exception is the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. So it's a time machine, really. You go there, it's not just monument to Lenin, it's slogans celebrating the Communist Party, the achievements. So you really go in time into the years 1985, 1984, 1986. And it's from that point of view, it becomes even easier to say that really what happened in Chernobyl belongs to the past. And it does belong to the past, but it is also should be and must be a concern of us today. I will deal with the topics that I just alluded to, not in chronological order, but more or less in way how historians say it's kind of a problematic approach. And one of the issues that I'm going to discuss will deal with the question of relationship between the nuclear weapons and the nuclear industry, which is extremely important today, as it was back in 1950s, 1960s, when the nuclear energy was when the nuclear industry was born. The relationship between the nuclear industry and economy, the relationship between nuclear and political system, and in particular authoritarian regimes. And I will also try to touch upon the questions of ecology, despite the fact that I'm not a specialist there, but I will try to present whatever I learned when I was working on this book. So the first theme that I announced, and the first theme that I'm going to discuss and deal with, is the relationship between the nuclear weapons and nuclear industry. Generally in the world, not only in the Soviet Union, the nuclear industry is kind of an afterthought after the bomb was created. First the atomic bomb and then hydrogen bomb. In the Soviet Union, they produced and built the first nuclear power plant. It was in Obninsk. But again, it was more like a showcase. It wasn't an industrial production. It was a very small enterprise. But the nuclear industry started really to develop in the United States in the 1950s. And the big nuclear plants they started to build at that time. And one of the reasons for that happening was that the US president at that point, Dwight Eisenhower, he was trying to sell nuclear to the American public as something that has not only destructive power, but also can be useful for economic development. He came up in 1953 with this idea, Atoms for Peace, and he was trying to do that. The Soviet Union woke up to the challenge that came with the American nuclear industry by the early 60s under Khrushchev. And the anecdote goes that Khrushchev summoned to his office these two gentlemen. They happened to come both from Ukraine, and according to that anecdote, he allegedly approached them in Ukrainian. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but that's the anecdote that exists in the field. So one of them is Mr. Alexandrov, who was at the moment when Chernobyl exploded, not only the academic director of the team that designed the reactor, but also the director of the Institute of Nuclear Energy, and also the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He happened to come from the Kiev region. He was a son of a prominent lawyer before the revolution of 1917. Other person on the right, his name is Yefim Slavsky. And Yefim Slavsky came from the area of today's Mariupol, and he was the minister of the, fasten your seatbelt, the ministry was called the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. What do you think it was? Well, it was the Soviet nuclear industry. The ministry that was a state within a state. Mr. Slavsky was the minister from the late 1950s until 1986. It happened, and those two people learned during the Chernobyl disaster that during the Civil War they were fighting each other on the different sides of the divide. So Mr. Alexandrov, who was the son of a prominent lawyer, was with the White Army, and Mr. Slavsky, who was a son of a Cossack from southern Ukraine, was in the Budyonny army, and they were fighting each other at that time. But By 1986, they were allies, and part of why they were allies, because they together worked on the first Soviet nuclear bomb. So they first built the bomb, and then, allegedly, according to that theory, Khrushchev called them and told, you know what, you guys have to create now a reactor for a nuclear power plant. And then the anecdote goes that he gave them a very short period of time. They went back home, they didn't know what to do, they put on TV, and on TV there was a well-known Soviet stand-up comic, Arkady Raikin, and he was giving his joke about the ballerine, and was saying, okay, the ballerine, she is swirling all around, and all this energy is really wasted. So what if you add a rotor, an engine to her, and in that way the Soviet ballet will be producing energy as well. So again, I don't think that's exactly what happened, but this is kind of a funny story, and it reflects the reality that those were the military guys who built nuclear bombs and nuclear reactors for enrichment of plutonium for the nuclear bomb. And they were tasked with this new goal of creating a reactor, and they created a reactor. Again, Alexandrov was the scientific advisor. It was Mr. Slavsky's ministry that was in charge of creating the reactor and running of the first reactor, which was called RBMK. It was a so-called water graphite reactor where graphite was used as a for the moderation of the reaction. It was a very dangerous type of reactor. The same kind of reactors actually went on fire in Britain in 1957. The problem was that, again, if graphite captures fire, it keeps burning. And that's what happened in Chernobyl. So most of the radiation that was released because the graphite in the active zone of the reactor kept burning. But there was one or maybe two wonderful things about the RBMK reactors as far as the Soviet economy and Soviet nuclear industry was concerned. The first one, it was cheap. You can build it without having actually special enterprises to do that. The orders could be placed at normal enterprises all over the Soviet Union. And second, it was more powerful than its competition. Another type of reactor that also was developed and built in the Soviet Union, which was like the reactors that existed later in France and in the United States, the so-called water-water reactor, where water was used to cool down the active zone, but also water was used as a moderation for reactors, so there was no graphite. So the first nuclear power plant near today St. Petersburg, back then Leningrad, was launched in early 1970s, and it was part of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, so it was a military industry. And in 1975, they had a situation close to the meltdown of the reactor. So in technical terms, it was something that very close to what happened later in Chernobyl. Because the reactor had one major issue, one major problem. So the way how the reaction is generally moderated is that there are these rods that go into the active zone of the reactor, and they slow it down or shut it down. The tips of those rods in the RBMK reactors were made also from graphite. And the immediate reaction was that instead of slowing down the reaction, the first thing that happens when the rods go down is the spike in the reaction. And when the circumstances are normal, this is not a big deal. But in Chernobyl they were not, and in Leningrad in 1975 they were not normal. The trick was that it was a military industry, and what happened there stayed there. So the information about the problems with the reactor were actually kept under wraps. The knowledge that was acquired was not shared in the industry, and no one, including at Chernobyl, knew what could happen. So That's one way in which the military origins of the nuclear industry in the Soviet Union certainly contributed to the disaster in Chernobyl and affected what happened there. Why it is important today? Today, the relationship between the nuclear power and the nuclear arms is as close as it was back in the 1950s and 1960s. The relation is there, but the way how it works is different. If in 1950s in UK, in US, in the USSR, first there was a bomb and then there was a nuclear power plant. Now it's the other way around, and the Indians were the first to show the way. So you first acquire nuclear power plant, you train your engineers, and then you get to the nuclear bomb. And today, the biggest number of the nuclear reactors that will be under construction and are about to be commissioned are not anymore in the United States, not in France, not in China. They're in the Middle East. And if you think about Middle East, you don't think that this is exactly the part of the world that needs additional sources of energy. In some areas this is the case, but not in others. So really this is a backdoor to acquiring nuclear weapons, and again, so that connection is still there. Another important element of the story, and this is relationship between the nuclear power and the economic development. I already mentioned that Chernobyl happened 2 months after the 27th Party Congress, which was an interesting Congress. It was the first time that Gorbachev was elected by the Congress as the General Secretary of the party. So that was the first time that he acquired full legitimacy and was able to start his reforms. In early 1986, they didn't know yet the word perestroika, or restructuring. But they had another word, which was called ускорение, acceleration. And acceleration meant basically that everything was more or less okay and fine with the economic system, how it existed at that time. You needed just to find the reserves and use them. And the way to find the reserves was to use, again, another Soviet coinage, which was called научно-технический прогресс, the scientific technological progress. And nuclear industry was at the very top of those expectations. So at the 27th Party Congress, they decided that in the next 5 years, they would build twice the number of the nuclear reactors that were built in the previous 5 years. So doubling the number of the reactors that would be under construction and would be commissioned. How they were going to do that? They were going to cut the time for the construction of the reactor from 7 years to 5 years. That 2 months before Chernobyl happened. And again, I already mentioned that RBMK reactors were the cheap reactors. So that was the way to go. And they were cutting costs not only on building RBMK reactors, but also on not building the shelter above the reactor, something that is standard practice at that time was in the United States. They were also trying to save money by this is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This is reactor number 4 already after the construction of the first shelter. Next to it is reactor number 3. This is reactor number 2 and number 1. So number 1 and number 2, they're actually built separately, but here they're already saving money. They build them in one unit, in one block. They also have one exhaust pipe, and also for all 4 reactors, you see this long thing, this is called machine hall. So they have the giant machine hall. That's also how you save money. You also put bitumen on the roof, something that burns beyond belief, because actually it's cheaper to do that than put something that would be fireproof at that point. So they're trying to cut costs, because they're there also to produce electrical energy. They're there to meet the 5-year targets and plans. And the worst thing, the operators of the reactor were interviewed after the explosion, after the accident. The worst thing that they could imagine could happen to them, for what they could be fired, or for what their bonuses could be taken away from them, was if they shut down the reactor without good reason for doing that, good reason in the eyes of their authorities. So when the explosion happens on the 4th reactor, so immediately the fire starts on the roof, on the bitumen roof of the reactor number 3, because it's there together. They were saving money. It also starts here on the roof of the machine hall. And the first responders to the accident, to the catastrophe, the firefighters, they really sacrificed their lives, but they did something really very important. They stopped the fire. They stopped the fire from getting to reactor number 3, and they stopped the fire from getting to reactors number 2 and 1. We don't know what would happen if the fire would still go on. Maybe nothing. Or maybe there would be a lot of short circuits. And what is short circuits in the as complex system as the operational system of the reactor? So we could very well can have another reactor going into the meltdown. Just to put things into perspective, what happened in Chernobyl? Only 5% of the fuel, mostly spent fuel, that was in reactor escaped. 95% is still there. And it was enough to cover with clouds half of Europe. Now, you can imagine what would happen if more than 5% would escape in one reactor, and what would happen if another reactor would go on, so on and so forth. So those people really did again, it wasn't just an act of heroism, that they did really something extremely important. Now, the Soviet Union was a particular kind of a state. By today's assessments, probably it wouldn't. The Soviet Union in the 1980s would not qualify probably as a totalitarian state, but it was an authoritarian state. And authoritarian and nuclear power means two things, and that's what it meant in Chernobyl. The first thing was that the state was in complete control of information. And in that sense, most of you who were around in 1986, you remember that the news about the explosion took, it took 3 days for the Soviet media to release a very terse, very short information that something happened. And that was only after the news already were there, when the Swedes discovered that there were high levels of radiation at their own nuclear power plants. They were really scared out of their mind that something was going wrong with their nuclear power plants, and only then they decided, okay, it was good, it was clean, and that the wind was coming from the other side of the Baltic. And they decided that something happened in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was still stonewalling. The information control, which meant information denial, was a big part of the way in which the state dealt with the disaster. It wasn't just denial of information, it was also an attempt to project an image of the Soviet Union as a state that was in complete control of what was going on, and sent an image that things were not just under control, they were fine. That's why we have someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, who is hailed, of course, as a major figure in bringing elements of democracy to the Soviet Union. He is also the one who is ordering the May Day parade in Kiev, in which participate school children, and the only thing that the local authorities managed to do, they cut the time of that manifestation from 4 hours to 2 hours. Now, in Kiev, they just launched a huge volume of documents, declassified documents from the KGB archives. And some of them are those documents that I worked with when I was researching this book. Others are absolutely new. And among new for me were the reports, the KGB reports, that were talking about the need to deactivate the uniforms in which the school children in Kiev practiced for the May parade. So on the school by school level. So that the situation was so bad. But again, the orders came to keep going, keep doing that. Why was that happening? Well, Gorbachev never really admitted any wrongdoing. By the way, it took him 18 days to address the nation about Chernobyl. It took him almost 3 years to come for the first time to Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And his explanation was we didn't have a complete information. Well, we still don't have complete information. We still don't know fully and entirely the physics of what happened. Again, there are different theories and different approaches. So this is not really an explanation. But the explanation was given, at least to me, the one that I believed in, was given by the second in command at that time in the Soviet Union, who was the head of the government, Nikolai Ryzhkov. And when one of the reporters kept asking him again and again, okay, why you were silent? Why were you allowing people to take in all these dosages of radiation? And he said, what did you want me to say? To say that the reactor exploded, that the world is coming to an end, and you, dear citizens, please save yourself any way you can. So that was the feeling at the top, that they were losing control, that the world was coming to an end, and the only way how they knew how to deal with the situation was actually to stay silent. Now, authoritarian regimes are exceptionally good not only at keeping the information, but also at mobilizing resources. So sometimes people are saying, if God forbid something like that would happen in today's Ukraine or Russia or Belarus or something like that, or even in a democratic country like the United States, I hear that again and again, whether the government would be powerful enough to mobilize all these resources the way how the Soviet Union was able to mobilize all of that. And the answer is probably not. But it's also very important to keep in mind that the main resource that the Soviet Union had at that time were people. And that's what they mobilized. 600,000 people, the so-called liquidators, were sent to the most dangerous place on earth at that time. And again, today we believe that probably not all of them were needed there. At that time, in Chernobyl Zone and around the zone, were stationed more people than is stationed today that is part of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. So more people in Chernobyl than now are in Donetsk and Luhansk. And of course, here you see the so-called biorobots. The people had to improvise, trying to protect themselves with these aprons made out of lead. Of course, the industry was not producing that, so they really had to deal with whatever they got. The so-called roof cats as well, so the people who were going on the roof of the third reactor and with their shovels were trying to take the pieces of radioactive graphite that were thrown from the mouth of reactor number 4, and then drop it on the ground. Again, the sad part of that story is, and we discussed that with Serhii earlier today, that we really don't know much what at the end happened to these people in terms of their health, in terms of their life trajectories. Again, the research was not done, and those were people, again, a lot of them came from Ukraine, a lot from Belarus, from Russia, but there were also people from other republics. And they came into the zone, they went back, they were released back to the general population. And again, the research was really never fully done. So again, that's the nature of the part of the story of the Chernobyl disaster that again is important to keep in mind, and it's a question with no clear answer. On the one hand, authoritarian regimes are very good at mobilizing resources. On the other hand, they're terrible when they're withholding the information, and they're wasting resources, in particular resources, the human resources. There is one more issue that came to the fore at the time of Chernobyl, and that's really the absence of the safety culture in the Soviet nuclear industry. There is an agreement that there were two main causes of the explosion of the reactor. The first one were the issues dealing with the deficiencies of the reactor. So this positive void effect that I just described, that when the rods go into the active zone of the reactor, the first reaction is the spike in the activity. The operators were saying, imagine that you are driving a car and you are trying to brake, and instead of brake it accelerates. So that's more or less the metaphor of what happened. But another big part of the story is that the guys who were running the test at that time, and it was very interesting, it was a safety test. They were trying the turbine for the possibility that there can be emergencies in the future, and they needed some extra electricity. So they were trying to make it safer, but they were trying to make it safer by violating any rule in the book about the safety precautions. And all of them were saying that, well, please show us one textbook, one instruction, one paper that says that reactors can explode. The idea was that in the Soviet Union, under socialism, under communism, reactors don't explode. Period. They don't explode. They were so convinced that that was the case that they showed the China Syndrome film, American film about accident at the American nuclear power plant a few years before Chernobyl, because they thought that, okay, it's about capitalism, it doesn't apply in the Soviet Union. And I have this two posters here to demonstrate the difference in the safety culture between the Soviet Union and the United States. So I'll start with this film, "9 дней одного года." Maybe some of you remember it, maybe you watched it. For those who didn't, who was lucky enough to be born later, I'll tell you the basic plot. So this is Alexei Batalov. This is, I don't know, George Clooney of 1960s in the Soviet Union. And he is playing a character that is loosely based on the story of the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, academician Kurchatov, who worked together with Slavsky, but Slavsky turned out to be having some kind of a special, I don't know, health abilities, that radiation somehow was not touching him. He was saying at Chernobyl, okay guys, you stay here, but I will go over there. After that I will drink a little bit and it will all disappear. So, but it's true that human body responds differently to radiation. So people who were around Slavsky, and he was there from early 50s, were long dead. And he was there in 1986 in his late 70s, early 80s, and when they ordered him out after he built the sarcophagus, he protested because he wanted to stay in the office until he was 100 years old. So the patron is not the president of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences had a precursor, a predecessor in Slavsky. So they were, eventually he was forced to write a resignation letter, and he wrote, please release me from this position because I started having problems with hearing on the left ear. So everything else allegedly was okay. But back to this film. So Batalov is a nuclear scientist, and he does a couple of crazy things for good reason. He's trying to save his friends, and he gets a high level of radiation, and he is suffering from that. He's also, at the same time, there is a love triangle. There is a girl that he loves, but she loves somebody else, and is going to marry that other guy. So Batalov gets really crazy and gets even more irradiated, doing even more stupid things. But again, in the name of the bigger goal, the interests of the state, the interests of his friends, and of course he wins the girl back. So she decides to marry him, and the film ends. They are getting ready him for operation, but he's the ultimate hero. So the idea is just go crazy. If the reason is right, risk your life, violate the rules, you are the hero, you will win the goal. Now, the China syndrome. Jack Lemmon, Jane Fonda, Michael Douglas. Not exactly George Clooney, but some of them were almost there. A very different story. The main character is Jack Lemmon. He works at the American nuclear power plant, and he notices that there are some violations with the safety procedures there. And the film is, he is really struggling. He doesn't know what to do. On the one hand, there is loyalty to his company. He's a company man. On the other hand, there are the issues of the bigger good, and he doesn't know what to do. Eventually, he decides actually to become a whistleblower. He decides to say what was going on. He's not getting Jane Fonda, but she interviews him at the end. So Jack Lemmon is a hero. So it's very, the radiation is portrayed even in the same way in the Soviet Union and in the United States, but the image of what is heroic and what is not is very different. Another big issue related to Chernobyl is the problem that someone identified for me. I was talking about that, but I didn't have a specific term for that. But that's the problem of the first generation engineers. What do I mean? 1950s and 1960s in the Soviet Union, 60s and 70s more specifically, is a period of the major expansion of the nuclear industry. And there is just no engineers trained to run nuclear power plants. Mr. Bryukhanov, the director of the plant, was trained and worked most of his life before he came to Chernobyl at the coal power plants. His second in command, Mr. Fomin, the chief engineer, no nuclear experience, no nuclear industry, no education in that particular field. And this is the norm. So the only guy who had some experience was Mr. Dyatlov, who screwed things up really, in a major way. And his previous experience were the small nuclear reactors at the Soviet submarines in the Far East. So you have the military guys with the experience of exploding bombs, and then you have the specialists in turbines and coal plants coming together and trying to run the industry, which of course then creates all sorts of issues and all sorts of problems. Now, a few words about the impact of Chernobyl, and probably I will stop there. This is the image of a animal that was born 1 or 2 years after the explosion. And it became a symbol of the damage that radiation does to human beings, but also to environment as a whole. The truth is that, unfortunately now, more than 30 years after the explosion, we still don't know what the impact has been. The animals like that, they appear also in normal times and in normal situations. So the question is not that, okay, there is an animal like that. The big question is how many are of them, whether there is increase or not. And we don't know answers to most of these questions. The number of people who died immediately after explosion is only 2. So this is the biggest disaster, nuclear disaster in the world history. The number of people who died in the weeks and months after that, being diagnosed with the acute radiation syndrome, is around 40. The rest are big question marks. So the number of deaths caused by Chernobyl are estimated anywhere between 4,000 to 100,000 people, depending on what statistics you use. Either it's the UN statistics or this is Greenpeace statistics. And again, the research, big part of that time was already lost, and we don't know what it is. What we know for sure? We know for sure that there was a major spike in the cases of thyroid cancer among children. They occurred, again, normally, under normal circumstances, but the spike accounted for approximately 4,000 extra cases, mostly in northern Ukraine, in parts of Belarus and parts of Western Russia. Belarus was the country, not Ukraine inherited the reactor, but Belarus was the country proportionally affected the most in terms of the contaminated territory, in terms of the people that were affected by that. The good thing about thyroid cancer is that it's relatively easy to diagnose and relatively easy to operate. So 4,000 thyroid cancer, that doesn't mean 4,000 deaths. It's 4,000 cases like that. Well, when you go today in the exclusion zone, it's a nuclear. I already said that it's kind of a time machine. It's a nuclear Pompeii. It's something that comes from the previous era, but it's different from Pompeii in the sense that you don't have to dig out to find the traces of the life that was there before you. It's there, and it's the nature that took over the squares, the streets, the soccer fields. Frankly, also one of my biggest surprise, and again, I was there in the late Soviet Union, and we considered that everything that was constructed at that time was shabby and it wouldn't withstand a test of time. So my biggest surprise is that those buildings are still standing there. But other than that, again, it's forest and it's animals. Even the types of the animals that were not there before the explosion, they came from all parts, including from Germany via the forest in Poland and Belarus, and got into the zone. And one conclusion is that, or possible conclusion is that the animals are more threatened by us human beings than they are threatened by radiation. But that's an overly optimistic approach. On my last trip there, and it was in January of this year, a tour guide introduced me to the area that is called the Red Forest, the Serhii Plokhy. And I knew a lot about it. I read archives, I read literature, I knew that was part of the forest that was close to the reactor. When the explosion took place, it took enormous amount of radiation, so it was pine forest, and it became, overnight, it became red forest, it became orange forest. But I knew that actually it was bulldozed already in the summer of 1986. So it sounded funny to me, and I saw, yeah, it was, the pine trees were affected by that. So how could that happen? And the tour guide explained to me, yes, they bulldozed it, and then there was the new forest that was growing on the place where there was the old one, and it is affected now. So it wasn't hit by radiation, but it grew from the burial of the old forest. So the issues are there, and the issues are extremely big and important. Is that when we think about the impact of Chernobyl, we think and about health impact and about impact on the environment, we are trying to look at physical things, thyroid cancer or red forest or something like that. But there is a big thing that is dealing with our mental health. And Ukraine today, the way how people feel about their health, is the sickest nation in Europe. And I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that in physical terms, Ukrainians are not the sickest nation in Europe. But in the way how people perceive themselves, how people perceive their health, that's what is happening. And that is also what that means. It affects your overall health as in general terms. Now, absolutely, the last sentence. Chernobyl now became really a battleground of different versions of what happened or what did not happen. There was demand for truth about Chernobyl, which means give us the map, and that's how the Ruch started. That's how the Ukrainian national mobilization started. That's how the Soyuz started in Lithuania. That's how the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union began. Truth about Chernobyl. Now truth is, again, a contested issue. So there is a new HBO series about that, and the questions that I get again and again, what is true and what is not true. And it looks like there is also an answer coming from Russia. Forget it, there was the CIA, that they're shooting their own mini-series where it's the CIA who exploded the Chernobyl. Whatever we think about what happened there, it is important for us and for us here in Ukraine in particular to think about Chernobyl not only as about history but also about potential future. Because when the word Chernobyl is pronounced, let's say in the United States or in UK, it's not their history or their own experience. This is about their concern about nuclear power that they have now and today. Germany decided to go nuclear free, for example. Japan is having that debate. UK is having this debate. Ukraine had this debate last time in 1990 and stopped debating that. Chernobyl now is about victimhood, about suffering, about history, about the evil Soviet regime, and all of that had some contribution to what had happened. But in Ukraine, for the last more than 30 years, we don't have discussion about Chernobyl as the way to think about what is happening with our nuclear power. And here in the land of Chernobyl, more than 50% of all electricity is produced by nuclear. Ukraine has the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. Do we discuss that? Do we think about that? For us, Chernobyl is just 1986. It's the night of it's commemorating the heroes, it's commemorating the victims. It's not looking forward. It's not thinking about what can happen next. This is not an argument that nuclear power should disappear or Ukraine should not do that. After all, France has 80% or more than 80% of its electricity coming from nuclear. China, US and Russia have more or less 20% of their electricity coming from nuclear. But it's about the need, again, to think not only back, but also think forward. And I hope that this lecture is also a small, very small contribution to that change in thinking as well. So thank you very much for your attention.